Paris in the 9th century was a city of immense importance, nestled along the banks of the Seine, its towering walls and grand churches symbolizing the strength of the Carolingian Empire. At the time, it was one of the wealthiest cities in Europe, a prize for any invader daring enough to seek it. But if you look beyond the grandeur, you'll see a city vulnerable to the storms that were already brewing across the continent. The political power of the Frankish Empire, which had been held together by Charlemagne, was weakening fast after his death in 14. The empire was fracturing, and with it, so were the once mighty defences of Paris. The walls of the city, while impressive by medieval standards, were laughable in the face of a full-scale siege. They were built for defense against the occasional raid, not a determined invasion by seasoned warriors. Meanwhile, the coastlines of France had already begun to feel the brunt of Viking raids. These Norsemen from the cold, unforgiving lands of Scandinavia were notorious for their savage raids, leaving nothing but ruin in their wake. The Frankish kings, distracted by internal power struggles and infighting, were unable, or unwilling, to stop them. Paris was now just another target, and the fear it sparked could be felt in every corner of the city. The idea of these raiders reaching the heart of the empire, where riches and power flowed like water, was a nightmare that seemed impossible. Until it wasn't. What happens when a group of fearless, bloodthirsty Vikings sets their sights on one of the wealthiest cities in Europe? You get a story of near destruction, terror, and unbelievable brutality. In the year 8045, Ragnar Lodbrok, one of the most infamous Viking leaders in history, would lead his warriors on a journey that would bring them to the gates of Paris. With more than 120 ships and thousands of warriors, the Vikings descended upon the city, unprepared for its defences, yet ready to claim the wealth that lay within its walls. This would not be a typical raid. This was a test, a brutal reminder that no city was safe from the fury of the Viking longships. As the sound of approaching oars grew louder, the people of Paris found themselves facing a terror unlike any they had ever imagined. The Vikings were more than just the barbarians of popular imagination. They were the scourge of Europe, a tidal wave of destruction that left history with scars that still echo today. Originating from the harsh, unforgiving lands of Scandinavia, the Vikings were a mix of warriors, traders, and settlers from what we now know as Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. Their homelands were cold, rugged, and isolated, and life there was as brutal as the environment itself. These were not people who relied on the stability of castles or the protection of mighty walls. No, the Vikings carved their own path, and their way was one of relentless conquest and expansion. To understand why the Vikings were so feared, we need to look at what made them so successful and so terrifying. Vikings were fierce warriors, honed in combat from a young age. The harsh conditions of Scandinavia bred a people who were tough, resourceful, and merciless when it came to defending their own. Their physical prowess was matched by a cunning strategic mind that made them masters of surprise and terror. They were raiders, sure, but they were also skilled in both land and sea warfare. Their aim was not just to pillage and plunder, but to carve out their own world, to take what they wanted, and to impose their will wherever they went. The Viking raids on France began in the late 8th century, and by the early 9th century, they had grown into something far more organized. The first recorded Viking raid on France occurred in 795, when they attacked the monastery of St. Philibert, located on the island of Noirmoutier. It was a small, but significant, beginning. The monks were helpless against the overwhelming Viking assault. As word of the Vikings' ferocity spread, so did their raids, which would eventually target the very heart of the Carolingian Empire, Paris. Viking raids were not some random act of piracy. They were methodical and part of a larger plan. These Norsemen weren't just taking what they could, they were laying the groundwork for the eventual expansion of Viking power into what we know today as Normandy and beyond. Paris, with its wealth and strategic importance, became the ultimate prize. One of the most terrifying aspects of the Viking threat was their ships. The Vikings were master shipbuilders, and their longboats were their most powerful weapon. These ships were a marvel of engineering, designed for both speed and versatility. They were long, sleek vessels that could navigate both open seas and shallow rivers with ease, allowing the Vikings to strike where their enemies least expected. The ships could carry dozens of warriors and were shallow enough to be beached easily, enabling swift disembarkations in even the most fortified of locations. But it wasn't just the ships themselves that were formidable. It was the way the Vikings used them. The longboats allowed for lightning, fast raids. The Vikings could appear at the shore, strike with terrifying speed, and be gone before the defenders even had a chance to react. This hit and run tactic was one of their key strategies, and it made them a nightmare for anyone who lived along the coasts or major riverways. In the early 9th century, the Vikings had perfected this strategy. With their longboats, they could sail up the rivers of Europe, most notably the Seine, allowing them to bypass the traditional coastal defenses. The element of surprise was on their side, and they used it to devastating effect. When they came with overwhelming force, striking fear into the hearts of those unlucky enough to be caught in their path. Entire towns were wiped out in the blink of an eye, their people slaughtered or taken as slaves. It was a terrifying prospect for anyone along the rivers of France. And Paris, being the crown jewel of the Carolingian Empire, was the ultimate target. It wasn't just the violence of the raids that made the Vikings so feared. It was the terror they sowed in the hearts of everyone they encountered. Their raids were not only brutal, but calculated. They would strike at random, leaving towns and villages in ruins, and then disappear as quickly as they came. This randomness, this unpredictability, made them all the more terrifying. They were always out there, lurking in the distance, waiting for the right moment to strike. It was a psychological warfare tactic as much as a physical one. They were the ultimate predators, and their prey had no safe haven. As the 9th century rolled on, the frequency and intensity of these raids escalated. In 845, Ragnar Lodbrok, one of the most famous and feared Viking leaders, led a massive fleet of Viking ships up the Seine River toward Paris. The fleet was a sight to behold. More than 120 ships filled with thousands of hardened warriors, all carrying with them the promise of death and destruction. They were not just raiders, they were an unstoppable force, and Paris was their next target. Ragnar's forces were seasoned veterans, battle-hardened and ready for anything. They had seen the destruction of countless towns and cities across Europe, and now they had set their sights on the mighty Paris. The Carolingian Empire, weakened by infighting and political instability, had little to offer in terms of resistance. The walls of Paris, while imposing, were no match for the fury of Ragnar's warriors. The city's defenders, if there were any left, were no match for the might of the Viking fleet, which could sail up the Seine and land directly at the gates of Paris without warning. It was the ultimate test of Viking might, and Paris, with all its wealth and prestige, stood as the last bastion against the growing Viking tide. Would it fall to the unstoppable force of Ragnar Lodbrok and his warriors? Would the heart of the Frankish Empire be swallowed by the Viking onslaught? The answer, as history would show, would come at a great cost. A cost that would not only be measured in gold and silver, but in the very survival of Paris itself. The Viking threat was no longer something that could be ignored. Paris was about to find out just how unprepared it really was for the storm that was coming its way. The political climate of the 9th century was one of chaos and fragmentation, a far cry from the glory days of Charlemagne's reign. Under Charlemagne, the Carolingian Empire had been a mighty force in Europe, uniting vast stretches of territory that stretched from present-day France, Germany, and Italy. His reign was one of expansion, culture, and consolidation, and his empire stood as a symbol of Christian might in the West. But Charlemagne's death in 814 marked the beginning of the empire's slow, painful decline. His successor, his son Louis the Pious, was unable to maintain the empire's unity, and the seeds of division were sown during his reign. After Louis' death, in 840, the empire was torn apart by a bitter civil war between his three sons. Each of them sought to carve out their own piece of the empire, leading to a fractured kingdom. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 divided the Carolingian Empire into three separate regions, one for each of Louis the Pious's sons. This fragmentation weakened the once mighty empire, leaving it open to outside threats, most notably the Viking raiders who had already begun to terrorize the coasts and rivers of Europe. Paris, as the heart of the Frankish kingdom, was left in a precarious position. The political instability within the empire left little room for defense, and the various factions vying for control were too busy fighting among themselves to mount a unified defense against the Vikings. While the city itself was still an important political and religious center, it was no longer the bastion of strength that it had once been under Charlemagne. The Vikings, ever watchful for weaknesses, saw Paris as the ultimate prize, ripe for the taking. And with the Frankish kingdom in disarray, they knew that no one would come to its aid. The defenses of Paris were just as inadequate as the political situation. In the 9th century, the city's fortifications were still primitive by modern standards. The walls of Paris were made of stone and timber, built more for defense against the occasional raider than a full-scale invasion. These walls, while sturdy enough to hold off local threats, were no match for the organized and disciplined Viking forces who had been raiding the coasts for decades. Paris had no standing army, no trained defenders capable of withstanding a siege of the magnitude the Vikings were capable of. The city's defenses were further weakened by the absence of a reliable or unified leadership, leaving Paris vulnerable to a coordinated assault. The Seine River, which was vital to the city's life and economy, became both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it was a major lifeline, providing water, trade routes, and access to the rest of the empire. On the other hand, the river was a perfect highway for Viking ships. The longboats, designed for shallow waters and quick maneuvering, could easily navigate the Seine, allowing the Vikings to sail directly into the heart of Paris with little resistance. While the river provided the city with trade and commerce, it also gave the Vikings an easy route to attack. It was only a matter of time before they would exploit this natural advantage. As the Viking ships appeared on the horizon, there was little the Parisians could do to stop them. The city, weakened by political strife and lacking the proper fortifications, was a sitting duck for Ragnar Lodbrok and his warriors. The Vikings, knowing this, were about to make their move, and Paris was about to feel the full weight of their brutality. But for now, the city's fate hung in the balance, caught between internal disarray and the looming terror of the Viking invaders. The storm was coming, and Paris, once a symbol of European power, was standing on the edge of destruction. ChatGPT said in the spring of 845, Ragnar Lodbrok, one of the most legendary and feared Viking leaders of all time, gathered his forces for what would become one of the most daring and significant raids in Viking history. Ragnar was no ordinary chieftain. He had a reputation that sent chills down the spines of even the most hardened warriors. Known for his strategic genius, brutal fighting style, and absolute ruthlessness, Ragnar had already earned his place in Norse sagas, long before he set sail for Paris. His fame had spread far and wide, and by the time he assembled his fleet, he had already left a trail of destruction across Europe. But his attack on Paris would prove to be the pinnacle of his campaigns. A calculated strike at the heart of the Frankish kingdom. Ragnar's fleet was nothing short of formidable. It consisted of over 120 longships, sleek, fast, and perfectly suited for the type of raid he had in mind. Each ship carried up to 30 or 40 warriors, giving Ragnar a force of thousands. These ships were the most advanced seafaring vessels of the time, capable of navigating both open seas and the shallowest rivers. They were built for speed and maneuverability, and when deployed correctly, they allowed Ragnar and his warriors to strike at their enemies with lightning speed and brutal efficiency. The ships were light enough to be dragged over land, if necessary, allowing the Vikings to attack places that were virtually impenetrable by any other force. Ragnar, with his strategic brilliance, knew exactly how to leverage this fleet. He didn't need to besiege Paris for months or waste resources on a drawn-out campaign. No, his plan was far more audacious. By sailing up the River Seine, Ragnar and his fleet could bypass the city's fortifications and strike directly at its gates. The Seine, a vital waterway for Paris, became the perfect highway for the Viking fleet, offering an easy, undetected route into the heart of the city. The river would allow the Vikings to avoid the cumbersome task of breaking through the city's walls, and they could reach the city faster than anyone could have anticipated. The Parisians, completely unprepared for an attack of this scale, were vulnerable in ways they didn't even realize. The strategic advantage of using the Seine was massive. Paris, despite its wealth and importance, had never experienced an invasion by such a large and organized force. The Frankish kings, distracted by internal struggles and political fragmentation, hadn't reinforced Paris' defenses in a meaningful way. The city relied on the river for trade and communication, but now it would become the very route that brought Ragnar's fleet to its gates. The Parisians, who had seen smaller Viking raids in the past, never anticipated that the Vikings would be capable of a coordinated assault of this magnitude. Ragnar knew that timing was everything. His fleet had been sailing along the coast of France, raiding villages and gathering resources for months, building up their strength and reputation as they went. They were a mobile, unstoppable force, one that could leave behind nothing but ash and ruin. By the time Ragnar reached the Seine, he was not just another Viking warlord, he was a juggernaut of destruction. And as he sailed his fleet toward Paris, he knew he had Paris in his sights. Meanwhile, Paris had no idea what was about to hit them. The city's defenses were practically non-existent against an organized attack by a fleet of Ragnar's size and skill. Paris had a handful of soldiers and a few local militias, but no trained, professional army capable of defending against the kind of force the Vikings could bring. The river, which had once been a lifeline for the city, now acted as an open invitation for the Vikings to land directly within striking distance of the heart of Paris. The Seine was about to become the conduit for one of the most famous raids in Viking history. To make matters worse, Charles the Bold, the King of West Francia, was embroiled in his own struggles with maintaining control over the fractured Carolingian Empire. His attention was divided, and he was not in any position to effectively coordinate a response to the Viking threat. The city's garrison was woefully underprepared to face the oncoming storm. What few fortifications there were around Paris had been constructed as a safeguard against minor raids, not the devastating force Ragnar was bringing. The city, with its walls of stone and wood, was more like a target than a stronghold. As Ragnar's fleet advanced up the Seine, the reality of Paris's situation became painfully clear. The city's defensive walls were barely a match for any siege, let alone the swift and brutal attack that Ragnar had planned. The Vikings were about to expose Paris' vulnerabilities in a way that no one could have predicted. Ragnar had chosen his moment perfectly. Paris was unready, its forces scattered and divided, and the river, once a symbol of life, was now the pathway to death. In the span of a few days, Paris would go from a thriving, prosperous city to a battleground. Ragnar's fleet had arrived, and the Parisians would soon learn just how ill Prepared they were to face an invasion of this scale. Ragnar Lodbrok and his warriors weren't just aiming to raid Paris. They were aiming to make a statement. And in doing so, they would force Paris to confront its own vulnerability and face the brutal truth. Even the wealthiest, most powerful cities in Europe were susceptible to the might of the Viking storm. In March of 1845, Ragnar Lodbrok's fleet finally reached the banks of the Seine, their longships cutting through the river's dark, turbulent waters as they made their approach toward Paris. The sight of so many Viking ships moving in unison, over 120 of them, their sleek hulls rising and falling with the waves, was enough to send a chill down anyone's spine. The Vikings were not just raiders this time. They were an unstoppable force, intent on tearing down the heart of the Frankish kingdom. As they sailed closer to the city, the Parisians had no idea of the disaster that was about to unfold. The French defenders, under King Charles the Bald, had little time to react. Paris, already stretched thin with its meager military forces, was unprepared for an attack of this magnitude. The city had a handful of soldiers, but no well-trained, organized defense force capable of holding back an assault of this scale. When Ragnar's fleet finally landed on the northern banks of the Seine, near the city's gates, panic spread like wildfire. The first Viking longships touched the shore with a deafening crash, and the warriors aboard, with their battle axes and swords gleaming in the dim light, wasted no time in leaping into action. They stormed the banks, shouting their battle cries, the sound of their voices echoing across the river as they made their way to the city. In a flash, the once peaceful riverbank became a scene of chaos. The Parisians, who had seen raids before, but never an invasion of this size, scrambled to defend themselves. The Vikings, however, were seasoned warriors, ruthless and methodical in their attack. They didn't just rush in blindly. They had a strategy, one that involved using fear, shock, and sheer force of numbers. As the first wave of warriors charged toward the gates of Paris, the city's defenders were caught completely off guard. Many of them were local militias, poorly equipped and poorly trained, and they had little chance against the Vikings' fierce assault. The Vikings set up camp near the city, their warriors unloading supplies, preparing for a full siege. The sight of the Vikings gathering strength outside the city walls struck terror in the hearts of the Parisians. The familiar security of the city's walls, which had once seemed impregnable, now felt like a prison, trapping the people inside with no hope of relief. The Vikings were not just here to pillage. They were here to make a statement, and the scale of their destruction was unimaginable. The city began to fill with smoke as the Vikings set fire to nearby farms and villages, sending plumes of black ash into the sky. The echoes of their battle cries were heard for miles around. Inside Paris, the mood was one of fear and confusion. The city's leaders were scrambling, trying to organize a defense, but it was already too late. The Parisians had no standing army, no professional soldiers to lead them in battle. The people were terrified, and their fear turned into a frantic desperation. As word spread that the Vikings were at the gates, it was clear that the city's fate hung in the balance. As the Vikings continued to attack, they turned their focus to the walls of Paris, the city's primary line of defense. The walls were made of stone, but they were not designed to withstand a full-scale siege by an organized force like the Vikings. The Parisians fought back with everything they had, hurling arrows and throwing stones, but the Vikings were relentless. They were used to fighting in brutal conditions, and the walls of Paris, while sturdy, were no match for the savage efficiency of the Viking warriors. The Vikings, led by Ragnar himself, pressed on with a singular goal: to break the city's defenses and force their way inside. They launched wave after of attacks on the gates and walls, their warriors battering them with axes and battering rams. It was a battle of sheer strength and willpower, with neither side willing to give an inch. Despite the Parisians' best efforts to hold their ground. The Vikings had the upper hand. Their numbers, their experience, and their sheer brutality overwhelmed the city's defenders. At one point, a small group of Parisian soldiers tried to hold the city gates, but they were quickly overrun by the Vikings. The sound of axes crashing against the gates echoed through the streets as the Vikings smashed their way through the city's defenses. Once the gates were breached, it was only a matter of time before the Vikings would flood the city, tearing through it like a tide of death. The Parisians fought bravely, but the Viking warriors, fueled by the promise of riches and the desire to break the Frankish Empire, showed no sign of stopping. The sheer scale of the attack was overwhelming. The Vikings fought with a ferocity that was unmatched, and soon the walls of Paris, once considered the last line of defense, were no longer enough to keep the invaders at bay. The Vikings breached the city, their warriors flooding through the gaps in the walls, and the sound of battle filled the streets of Paris. The people, who had once lived in relative peace and comfort, now found themselves caught in a nightmare of destruction, their city overrun by a force that would leave it scarred for years to come. The Viking siege of Paris was a brutal and chaotic affair. Ragnar's warriors showed no mercy as they tore through the city, burning houses, killing defenders, and taking what they could. The city, once a symbol of Frankish power, was now a shadow of its former self, its streets filled with the sounds of battle and the cries of the dying. The Vikings had not only breached the walls, they had breached the very heart of the Carolingian Empire. Ragnar Lodbrok was not just a man, he was a living legend, a towering figure in the sagas of Norse history, whose exploits have been woven into the very fabric of Viking lore. His name is synonymous with fearlessness, cunning, and a ruthless drive for conquest. While the historical accuracy of many aspects of his life may be shrouded in myth, the stories surrounding him have made him one of the most iconic figures in Viking history. Ragnar's reputation as a fearless warrior and an exceptional leader of raiders has endured for centuries, making him a symbol of Viking strength and cunning. According to the sagas, Ragnar was a man of larger-than-life stature, both in physical presence and in his actions. His exploits were the stuff of legends, and his ability to outsmart and overpower enemies made him a hero in the eyes of his followers, and a nightmare for those who crossed him. He was a king, a warrior, and a father of sons who would become legendary in their own right. His raids on Britain, Ireland, and France were not mere skirmishes. They were grand, ambitious endeavors meant to cement his place in Viking history. He became famous for his ability to plan and execute raids with precision, his leadership qualities that inspired loyalty in his men, and his penchant for making ruthless, decisive moves. Ragnar wasn't just another Viking chieftain. He was the embodiment of Viking ideals: strength, ferocity, and an unwavering thirst for glory. Ragnar's fame grew not just because of his violent raids, but because of his calculated approach to warfare. Unlike many raiders who simply attacked villages and towns for plunder, Ragnar had a different vision, one that saw him not only as a raider, but as a conqueror, a man who could bring entire kingdoms to their knees. His attack on Paris in 845 was a prime example of this strategic brilliance. Rather than simply aiming for quick plunder and retreat, Ragnar's objective was far more ambitious. He understood that attacking the heart of the Frankish Empire would not only bring him riches, but would also send a message to the rest of Europe. By striking at Paris, the seat of the Carolingian kings, Ragnar aimed to weaken the very foundation of the Frankish kingdom. He wasn't just after gold, he was after power, prestige, and a place in history. And by targeting Paris, he sought to destabilize the empire from within, to shake its core and create a ripple effect that would resonate across Europe. Ragnar's strategy was methodical, calculated, and devastating. He knew the Vikings' strength lay in their ability to move quickly, strike hard, and disappear before their enemies could retaliate. His attack on Paris wasn't just a typical raid. It was a carefully planned assault designed to exploit the weaknesses of the Frankish kingdom. By sailing up the Seine River, Ragnar bypassed the city's coastal defenses and moved straight to the heart of Paris. The river, which was vital for the city's economy and communication, became a perfect highway for the Viking fleet. Ragnar's knowledge of seafaring tactics and his ability to move his forces with precision were key to the success of the raid. He knew that the element of surprise would give him the advantage, and he used it to devastating effect. The Vikings, under Ragnar's leadership, were more than just marauding barbarians. They were a well-organized, highly disciplined force that was able to coordinate attacks with ruthless efficiency. While many Viking raids were characterized by chaos and violence, Ragnar's leadership brought order to the battlefield. He inspired loyalty in his men, and they followed him with a fervor that was unmatched. They trusted in his ability to lead them to victory, and in turn, they were willing to fight to the death for him. This sense of unity and purpose made the Vikings under Ragnar's command an unstoppable force. They knew no fear, and they had no mercy. For them, the raid on Paris wasn't just about the spoils of war. It was about proving their dominance and sending a message to the world. Ragnar's attack on Paris also marked a turning point in Viking history. It was one of the most daring and successful raids of the time, and it demonstrated the Vikings' ability to take on the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. The raid on Paris shattered the illusion of security that the Carolingian Empire had enjoyed, revealing the vulnerability of even the most powerful cities in Europe. It sent shockwaves through the Frankish kingdom and Europe as a whole, proving that no city was safe from the Viking threat. Ragnar's success at Paris proved that the Vikings weren't just raiders. They were a force to be reckoned with, capable of changing the course of history with their ruthless determination. Ragnar's cunning leadership and strategic brilliance didn't just make him a legendary figure in Norse mythology. They made him a symbol of the Viking Age itself. His tactics, his ability to strike at the heart of an empire, and his ruthless efficiency in battle set a new standard for Viking raiders. Ragnar Lodbrok's attack on Paris wasn't just another raid. It was a demonstration of what the Vikings were capable of when they were led by a master strategist. The legacy of Ragnar and his warriors would live on in the annals of Viking history, and his name would continue to be spoken with both awe and fear across Europe for centuries to come. As the siege of Paris dragged on, the once proud city began to buckle under the weight of the Viking onslaught. Ragnar and his warriors, relentless and cunning, had cut off Paris from its lifelines. The city's defenders, who had once hoped to hold off the invaders, were quickly running out of options. The siege had been going on for weeks, and Paris, though still holding its walls, was slowly beginning to suffocate. The initial fear and chaos had turned into a grim endurance test, with starvation and dwindling resources setting in. Charles the Bold, the King of West Francia, found himself in an impossible position. As the ruler of a fractured empire, he was already struggling with internal political chaos and rebellion. His kingdom, divided by infighting and unrest, was too weak to mount a proper defense against the Vikings. Paris, the crown jewel of his empire, was in jeopardy, and with every passing day, Ragnar's forces grew stronger and more confident. Charles had options, but none of them were good. He could either continue to resist and risk Paris being utterly destroyed, or he could try to buy the Vikings off, hoping that a hefty ransom would save his people. The decision wasn't an easy one for Charles. His pride as a king and his duty to protect his people conflicted with the harsh reality of the situation. Paris was facing a siege by one of the most feared Viking warlords in history, and the city was not equipped to withstand it much longer. The once proud Frankish defenders were growing weak and demoralized, and hunger was beginning to take its toll on the city. The gates of Paris were still holding, but the walls were crumbling in spirit, if not in structure. Supplies were running low, and there were whispers in the streets of surrender. Desperation set in. Paris had never faced a siege of this scale, and its defenders, lacking the military strength to defeat Ragnar, were growing increasingly aware of their vulnerability. The city was running low on food, and with each passing day, the situation grew bleaker. The Vikings, of course, had no such problems. They were masters of survival, their warriors well fed and well equipped for the long haul. The Vikings had a never-ending supply of rations, and as they camped outside the walls of Paris, they were able to sustain themselves with ease. The city, on the other hand, was slowly starving. It wasn't long before the air inside the walls grew thick with the stench of desperation. With no clear military solution in sight, Charles the Bold reluctantly turned to diplomacy. It was a tactic he had hoped to avoid, but the situation was growing dire. If Paris was to survive this siege, he would have to offer Ragnar something that could persuade him to lift the siege. Charles, despite his reluctance, sent emissaries to the Viking camp, hoping to negotiate a truce or, at the very least, a ceasefire. Ragnar, ever the shrewd tactician, saw an opportunity. He knew the situation was in his favor, and he also knew that the French king would do anything to save his city. The Vikings weren't just here for the thrill of conquest, they were here for wealth. Ragnar and his warriors were raiding for one thing above all else: treasure. Paris, with its immense wealth and strategic importance, was a golden prize. Ragnar was no fool. He understood that a siege could go on for months, or even years, but there was a quicker way to get what he wanted: money. Ragnar demanded a ransom of 7,000 pounds of silver, an astronomical sum that would have been enough to buy entire villages. The sum was a deliberate move, a reflection of both Ragnar's thirst for riches and his understanding of the value of Paris. He knew that Charles would be reluctant to pay such a hefty amount, but he also knew that the king had no other choice. For Charles, the demand was staggering, but the alternative was worse. The fall of Paris would be a blow to his authority that could never be undone. If the city fell, it would shatter any remaining hope of restoring order to the Carolingian Empire. Worse yet, it would send a message that the Viking threat was too powerful to stop, that even the greatest cities could be brought low by a few hundred warriors. It would have been a devastating blow to the prestige of the Frankish kingdom, one from which it might never recover. Reluctantly, Charles agreed to Ragnar's terms. He gathered what wealth he could muster and handed over a vast sum of gold and silver, hoping that this would be enough to secure the release of Paris. The Vikings, true to their word, accepted the ransom, and after receiving the payment, Ragnar and his warriors withdrew from the city. The Parisians, exhausted, starving, and demoralized, breathed a collective sigh of relief. The Vikings had won, but at least the city remained standing. For now. But the cost of the ransom wasn't just in gold. Charles had paid with the very soul of his kingdom. The French king had bought the Vikings' withdrawal, but he had also made a powerful statement. The Frankish kingdom was weak, and it could be bought. Ragnar's attack on Paris wasn't just a victory on the battlefield. It was a victory of strategy, diplomacy, and the cold, hard reality of power. The Vikings had shown that they could strike at the heart of the Frankish Empire, take what they wanted, and leave without even having to break the city's walls. For Ragnar, the ransom was just another way of claiming his victory, one that would leave a lasting scar on Paris and the Carolingian Empire. When Ragnar and his fleet finally accepted the massive ransom of 7,000 pounds of silver, it marked the end of the immediate Viking threat to Paris. The city's gates, which had stood firm for so long under the siege, were no longer under threat of Viking destruction. at least for the time being. The Parisians, exhausted and ravaged by weeks of terror, rejoiced at their survival. The Vikings had taken their gold, their silver, and their peace of mind, but at least the city remained standing. For Charles the Bald, this was a bitter victory. The ransom had spared Paris, but the cost was far greater than any sum of money could have compensated for. As Ragnar's fleet turned away from the city and sailed back down the Seine, the sight was one of both relief and humiliation. The city had been saved, but the king's decision to pay the Vikings had left a deep scar on his reputation. Charles the Bald, who had once hoped to assert his power and restore the glory of the Carolingian Empire, now appeared weak and incapable of defending his own people. The ransom had bought temporary peace, but it had also exposed the inherent vulnerability of Charles' reign. In the eyes of many, the payment to Ragnar was seen as an admission of failure. The Frankish king had been forced into submission, offering up a fortune to buy off the Vikings instead of defending his kingdom with force. To the people of Paris and the wider Carolingian Empire, Charles' willingness to pay for peace was a stark symbol of his weakness. It was as if the Carolingian Empire itself had been forced to kneel before the Vikings, a force that had once seemed like little more than a nuisance. Now, they had shown that they could bring even the greatest city in the Frankish kingdom to its knees, and get paid handsomely for doing so. The aftermath of the raid would reverberate throughout Europe for years to come. The payment made by Charles the Bald not only saved Paris in the short term, but it also emboldened the Vikings in ways that would prove disastrous for the Carolingian Empire. Ragnar's success was not just a tactical victory, it was a psychological one. By extracting such a large ransom, Ragnar had shown that the Vikings were not just barbarians looking for plunder, they were powerful, strategic players on the European stage. Future Viking raids would be even more daring and costly for the Carolingians. Charles' decision to pay the ransom may have spared Paris from destruction, but it set a dangerous precedent. The Vikings now knew that the empire could be bought, and that knowledge would linger long after Ragnar's fleet had disappeared from the Seine. The Viking threat, far from being quelled, only grew stronger after the raid on Paris. Ragnar's victory was celebrated by his warriors as a massive win, and the spoils from Paris fueled even more Viking expeditions in the years that followed. The Frankish Empire, weakened by internal strife and now publicly humiliated, was unable to mount a proper defense against future Viking raids. The Carolingians were left with the bitter realization that no city, no matter how well fortified, was safe from the Viking storm. Charles the Bald's failure to defend Paris marked a turning point in the Viking Age. The Vikings, emboldened by their victory, would continue to launch raids on the Frankish kingdom and beyond. Paris was no longer a symbol of Frankish strength. It had become a symbol of vulnerability. The empire, which had once ruled over much of Western Europe, was now seen as a weakened power, unable to protect its own cities from the Viking menace. For the people of Paris, the aftermath of the raid was filled with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. While the city had been spared from immediate destruction, the looming threat of future Viking raids hung over them like a dark cloud. The city's defenses had been tested and found wanting. The payment to the Vikings, though it had preserved the city's physical integrity, had come at the cost of its security and reputation. The Parisians had survived, but their world had been forever altered. As for Ragnar, his raid on Paris would go down in history as one of the most successful and strategically brilliant Viking raids of all time. The ransom he extorted from Charles the Bald made him a legend, and his reputation as a cunning and ruthless leader only grew. Ragnar had proven that the Vikings were not just mindless barbarians. They were a force to be reckoned with, capable of outsmarting even the most powerful rulers in Europe. His success at Paris would go down in history as a testament to the power and cunning of the Viking Age. But for the Carolingian Empire, the price of that success was steep. Charles the Bald's failure to protect Paris, his decision to pay the Vikings off, and the humiliation of seeing his kingdom's prestige shattered all served to weaken the empire in ways that would have long-lasting consequences. Paris, though spared from destruction, had become a symbol of the empire's decline, a reminder that even the mightiest empires could be brought to their knees by the most unlikely of adversaries. And with that, the Vikings would continue to press their advantage, raiding and pillaging, until the entire continent would feel the full force of their wrath. The raid on Paris in 845 had profound, lasting consequences for both the Frankish Empire and the Vikings themselves. While the immediate impact was the extraction of a massive ransom from Charles the Bald, the raid also exposed the deep vulnerabilities within the Carolingian Empire. The Frankish kingdom, once a dominant force in Europe, had been made to appear weak and divided. The Vikings, whose reputation had been that of mere marauders and raiders, were now seen as a real political and military threat. Ragnar's attack on Paris was not just a tactical victory. It was a game-changer, a wake-up call for the empire that the very heart of its power could be so easily struck. In the years following the raid, Paris would remain a frequent target for Viking raids. The Carolingian kings, unable to effectively defend their borders, watched as the Vikings continued to plunder their lands. Despite the initial payment and temporary peace, the damage had been done. The Vikings had proven that the Frankish Empire was vulnerable, and they would continue to exploit that weakness. As Ragnar's victory reverberated throughout Europe, the Vikings were emboldened. They were no longer just sea raiders. They were conquerors, capable of challenging even the mightiest kingdoms in Europe. But the raid also set the stage for a more permanent Viking presence in France. In the years following the attack, Viking raids became more organized, more frequent, and more sustained. The Vikings began to carve out territories for themselves, with the area that would eventually become Normandy emerging as a key focal point. Over time, Viking settlers, driven by both the promise of land and the opportunity to spread their influence, began to settle in northern France. In 911, a significant political shift occurred with the Treaty of St. Clair sur Epte. The treaty, signed by the Viking chieftain Rollo and the Frankish king Charles the Simple, granted the Vikings land in Normandy in exchange for their loyalty and protection. This marked the beginning of Viking settlement in France and the creation of the Duchy of Normandy, one of the most important and influential Viking legacies in Europe. The Vikings, once feared raiders, had now become landowners and rulers. They had transitioned from pillaging to establishing a permanent foothold in Europe, and their legacy would last for centuries. The influence of the Vikings in Normandy was immense. Over time, the Norse settlers assimilated into the local culture, adopting Christianity and French customs, and their descendants would go on to play pivotal roles in European history. One of the most famous of these descendants was William the Conqueror, who would later use his Viking heritage to justify his invasion of England in 1066, changing the course of British history forever. But the legacy of the 845 raid went beyond just political changes in France. It was a pivotal moment in Viking history that marked the rise of a new chapter for the Norsemen. The Vikings were no longer just feared raiders. They were becoming integral players in the European political landscape. The raid on Paris was a precursor to a more expansive Viking strategy of conquest, settlement, and assimilation. Over the next several decades, Viking raids continued to shape the fate of Europe. From England to Ireland, from Spain to Italy, the Vikings left their mark on the continent. Their raids brought destruction, but they also brought cultural exchange, trade, and the eventual formation of new kingdoms. The raid on Paris in 845 despite its failure to destroy the city, became a symbol of Viking resilience and determination. Ragnar Lodbrok's success in extracting a ransom from Charles the Bold demonstrated the power of Viking strategy, and it sent a clear message. The Vikings were here to stay. What began as a series of small, chaotic raids gradually evolved into a complex network of Viking kingdoms and settlements across Europe. The Viking Age, which had begun as a period of violent invasions, had transformed into an era of Viking influence and integration. For the Carolingian Empire, the aftermath of the raid was a slow, painful decline. The humiliation of paying off the Vikings, coupled with the growing internal divisions within the empire, made it harder for Frankish kings to maintain control. The once mighty Carolingian Empire was fractured, with its borders constantly under threat from Viking incursions, internal rebellions, and external pressures. The loss of control over regions like Normandy further weakened the empire's ability to defend its lands. And over time, France would evolve into a patchwork of feudal territories, many of which were ruled by Viking-descended leaders. For the Vikings, the raid on Paris was a stepping stone to a new era. It was a moment of triumph that paved the way for the establishment of Viking settlements and kingdoms in France. As the Vikings moved from being raiders to rulers, they left a lasting impact on the course of European history. The Viking raids that had once terrorized the continent now evolved into Viking rule, and the descendants of Ragnar Lodbrok and his fellow raiders would go on to shape the future of Europe in ways that no one could have imagined. The Viking legacy, born in the blood and fire of raids like the one on Paris, would endure long after the last Viking ship had sailed. From the creation of Normandy to the eventual establishment of Viking kingdoms in England, Ireland, and beyond, the Vikings' influence would continue to be felt across Europe for centuries. The raid on Paris, while a moment of destruction and terror, was also a moment of transformation, marking the beginning of a new chapter in both Viking history and European history. The legacy of Ragnar Lodbrok and the Viking Age goes far beyond the violent raids and bloody battles that have made them infamous in European history. While the Vikings were undoubtedly fierce warriors, their true legacy lies in their culture, their exploration, and the far-reaching impact they had on the world. The Viking Age wasn't just a time of destruction and conquest, it was also a time of profound transformation, in which the Norsemen not only ravaged lands but also shaped them. They didn't simply destroy, they built, traded, and explored territories that would forever alter the map of Europe and beyond. Viking culture was rich and multifaceted. The Vikings were not just warriors. They were also skilled craftsmen, traders, farmers, and explorers. Their long ships, which allowed them to raid and trade far and wide, were marvels of naval engineering, designed to navigate both open seas and shallow rivers with equal ease. This advanced seafaring technology enabled them to travel farther than most people in Europe at the time. Their raids on coastal cities, including Paris, were just one part of their complex cultural identity. The Vikings also established trade routes that spanned from the British Isles to the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and even as far as Constantinople and the Middle East. They brought goods from the farthest corners of the world: silver, furs, slaves, and timber, while also exchanging knowledge and culture with the societies they encountered. The Viking Age wasn't just about pillaging, it was also about settlement and the establishment of new kingdoms. The Vikings began to plant roots in the lands they had once raided. After Ragnar's raid on Paris, the rise of Normandy was inevitable. In 911, when the Viking chieftain Rollo and King Charles the Simple reached an agreement at the Treaty of St. Clair, the Vikings were granted land in what would become Normandy. This was a turning point for both the Vikings and for France. The settlement of Normandy allowed the Norsemen to transition from being raiders to rulers. They established a strong, enduring presence in northern France, and their descendants would go on to play a pivotal role in European politics. One of the most notable examples of this is William the Conqueror, a descendant of Ragnar's own people, who would later invade England in 1066, solidifying the Vikings' place in European history. Beyond Normandy, Viking influence spread through their explorations. The Vikings discovered and briefly settled areas in the North Atlantic, such as Greenland and Iceland. They were among the first Europeans to reach North America, with Leif Erikson landing in what is now Newfoundland, Canada, around the year 1000, almost 500 years before Columbus. Their voyages, driven by curiosity and the search for new lands, showed the world that the Vikings were more than just conquerors. They were pioneers, charting new frontiers in an age when the seas were still largely uncharted. While Ragnar Lodbrok's raid on Paris didn't destroy the city, it became a defining moment in Viking history. The attack itself and Ragnar's strategic brilliance were emblematic of the Viking ethos: audacious, bold, and willing to take on the mightiest of empires. The memory of this raid, and the fact that the Vikings had come so close to bringing down one of the most powerful cities in Europe, became a symbol of their strength and power. It was a tale that would be passed down through the generations, growing into legend and myth. In Viking sagas and folklore, Ragnar's raid on Paris took on a mythical quality. It wasn't just about the riches they took. It was about the sheer audacity of it. A handful of Viking ships, sailing up the Seine, bypassing the city's defenses, and forcing a king to pay a massive ransom was a story of triumph. For the Vikings, Paris became a symbol of their ability to challenge and defeat the most powerful forces in Europe. Even though Paris wasn't destroyed, the raid itself became a symbol of Viking dominance, a message to Europe that the Vikings were no mere raiders, but formidable adversaries who could strike at the heart of the continent. Ragnar's raid didn't just burn a city, it burned a permanent mark into the collective memory of both the Vikings and the Europeans they raided. In Viking mythology, Paris became more than just a city. It became a symbol of Viking audacity, cunning, and power. Ragnar Lodbrok's name became synonymous with Viking glory, and the tales of his raids, particularly the one on Paris, were passed down through the generations. These sagas, recited around campfires and in great halls, immortalized Ragnar as the ultimate Viking hero. For the Norsemen, Paris represented the peak of their raids, a city so powerful, yet so vulnerable, that it could be brought to its knees by the force of a few determined warriors. The raid on Paris became a symbol of Viking defiance, a reminder that no city, no empire, was beyond their reach. In a broader sense, the legacy of Ragnar and the Vikings extended far beyond their raids on Paris. The Viking Age was a time of profound change, where the Vikings went from being feared raiders to rulers and settlers. They shaped the political landscape of Europe, and their culture and influence can still be seen today. The Vikings didn't just leave behind tales of brutality. They left behind a legacy of exploration, settlement, and cultural exchange that helped shape the world as we know it. As we look back at the Viking Age, it's clear that the impact of Ragnar Lodbrok and his warriors was far-reaching. While the raid on Paris may have been just one chapter in the long history of Viking raids, it represents a turning point. A moment when the Vikings, for all their ferocity, began to carve out a permanent place for themselves in European history. The Vikings weren't just a passing storm of destruction. They were a civilization that shaped the course of history, from the shores of Normandy to the streets of Paris and beyond. Ragnar's legacy, like that of the Vikings themselves, is not just about the destruction they caused, but the world they helped build. A world where their descendants would become kings, explorers, and rulers, forever altering the course of history. Paris, though saved from complete destruction, was forever marked by the Viking raid of 845. The city's survival came not through military might or strategic brilliance, but through a vast payment of gold and silver, a desperate attempt to appease the invading forces. The Frankish Empire, once a symbol of power and unity under Charlemagne, was left bruised and humbled. Charles the Bald's decision to buy off the Vikings rather than face them in open battle was a stark reminder of the political instability that plagued the Carolingian realm. For the people of Paris, the raid was a close call, a brush with annihilation. The city had escaped, but it had done so at the cost of its dignity and its prestige. The payment to the Vikings, far from being a simple ransom, became a symbol of the empire's weakness. Paris, the heart of the Frankish kingdom, had been shown to be vulnerable, and that vulnerability would only embolden future Viking raids. The Frankish Empire was no longer the indomitable force it once was. It was fractured, its prestige shattered, and its ability to defend itself seriously questioned. The scar left by the raid would linger in the collective memory of the people, a reminder that no empire is invincible, no city truly safe from the forces of chaos. The political climate in the 9th century was precarious. The Carolingian Empire had been weakened by internal strife, succession issues, and external threats like the Vikings. Charles the Bald's inability to effectively protect his capital further exposed the fragile nature of power during this period. Unlike the highly organized, centralized states we think of today, medieval kingdoms were fragile, dependent on a delicate balance of alliances, military strength, and diplomacy. Charles' reliance on negotiation rather than military force showed just how easily that balance could be disrupted, and how quickly an empire could crumble in the face of relentless invaders. Now, imagine for a moment a world where the Vikings had succeeded in their conquest of Paris. What if Charles the Bald had failed to negotiate a ransom, and the city had fallen to Ragnar and his warriors? The consequences for Paris and the Carolingian Empire would have been catastrophic. Paris, the capital of the empire, would have become just another Viking stronghold, its wealth plundered, and its people either slaughtered or enslaved. With Paris in Viking hands, the center of power in Western Europe would have shifted dramatically, weakening the already fragile Frankish monarchy. The ripple effects of such a loss could have led to the further disintegration of the Carolingian Empire, possibly paving the way for a Viking-led France. The fall of Paris could also have drastically altered the future of Europe. The Carolingians, weakened by the loss of their capital, might have been unable to repel future Viking invasions, allowing Viking influence to spread even further. France, a region that would later become a center of medieval power, might have been subsumed into a Viking-controlled empire, changing the course of European politics forever. What about England? With the Carolingian kings distracted or weakened, would the Viking invasions of Britain have been far more successful, pushing England into Viking hands even earlier? Or would the collapse of Paris have given rise to more Viking kingdoms and settlements throughout Europe, further entrenching their power? The raid on Paris in 8045, though it didn't result in total Viking conquest, could have been the pivotal moment in European history that changed everything. As we look back on this narrow escape, it's clear that history is often shaped by moments of precarious luck and improbable survival. Ragnar's raid was one of those moments. A dramatic, tense confrontation that, had it played out differently, could have shifted the course of European history for centuries. The world we know today is the product of countless twists of fate, decisions made in moments of desperation, and the narrow escapes of those who barely managed to survive. Paris, though spared in 845, was forever changed by the raid. The Carolingian Empire, though it continued to exist for a time, would never fully recover from the humiliation and vulnerability exposed by the Vikings. The political landscape of Europe would continue to be shaped by the Viking incursions which would lead to the eventual establishment of Viking kingdoms in places like Normandy and the British Isles. And so, as we reflect on the Viking raid that almost destroyed Paris, we are reminded of the fragility of power, the unpredictability of history, and the legacy of those who, through their audacity, forever changed the world. What could have been a moment of European collapse instead became the catalyst for a new era, one where the Vikings would leave an indelible mark on history. Paris survived, yes. But what if it hadn't? The very course of European history might have been altered in ways we can only imagine.